mob, wanted the outlaw dead by sunrise. But the man standing between them and the rope was the last gunslinger anyone expected to defend a killer. In the winter of 1873, the town of Black Hollow woke to the sound of horses and anger. Dust rolled through the empty main street while men gathered outside the old saloon, their rifles resting against their shoulders. Word had spread before the sun even touched the rooftops. They had caught him, the outlaw. His name was Samuel Crow. For 3 years, Crow had been a ghost riding through the Western Territories, robbing stagecoaches, burning ranches, and leaving behind bodies that no one wanted to count twice. His name alone could silence a room. Some called him a devil wearing a man's face. That morning, he wasn't a legend. He was a wounded man tied to a post in the center of town. Blood darkened his shirt. One eye was swollen shut. The rope around his wrists had already soaked red wear. He struggled against it. A small crowd gathered in a quiet circle, watching him the way people watch something dangerous that has finally been caught. No trial, no judge, just rope and a tree. Sheriff Dalton stood nearby, pretending the law still existed in Black Hollow, though everyone knew he had already lost control of the situation. When townspeople decide someone deserves to die, a badge becomes decoration. Someone in the crowd shouted first. "Hang him," another voice followed. "Hang the butcher." Crow lifted his head slowly, breathing hard, his face pale from blood loss. But there was no begging in his eyes. Only the exhausted look of a man who had been running too long. Then the crowd suddenly shifted. Not because Crow spoke, because someone else had arrived. A single rider moved through the street, his horse stepping slowly through the dust, as if the chaos around him meant nothing. His coat was dark, his hat pulled low, and the revolver on his hip looked older than most of the men holding rifles. The townspeople recognized him immediately. Some stepped back. Some whispered his name, Jonah Vale, a gunslinger who hadn't been seen in Black Hollow for nearly 10 years. He dismounted without hurry, tied his horse to the rail outside the saloon, and walked straight toward the mob. No one spoke until Jonah Vale stopped beside the beaten outlaw and quietly cut the rope from Samuel Crow's wrists. For a moment, no one in town understood what they had just seen. Then Jonah turned toward the crowd and said the words that froze the entire street. "No one touches him." 10 years earlier, before Black Hollow became a place ruled by fear and rumors. 2 young men rode into town with nothing but dust on their boots and hope they barely understood. Jonah Vale and Samuel Crow arrived together back then. Neither of them were famous. Neither were killers. They were just riders, looking for work. Jonah was the quieter of the two, a man who spoke little but watched everything. Even in those early days, people noticed something about him. He moved slowly, calmly, like a man who never rushed because he never needed to. Samuel Crow was the opposite. Crow laughed louder, talked faster, and trusted people more easily than the world deserved. If Jonah was the shadow, Crow was the sunlight beside it. They balanced each other in a way most friendships never do. For a while, the 2 men worked honest jobs. They drove cattle through dry valleys, guarded supply wagons across dangerous desert roads, and slept under open skies where the wind never stopped moving. Nights were filled with quiet conversations beside campfires and the distant sound of coyotes, but the West was never kind to honest men. It happened during a winter shipment run through the AI Stone Pass. Jonah and Crow had been hired to escort a payroll wagon carrying thousands of dollars meant for a mining company. The job was supposed to be simple: ride with the wagon, keep bandits away, and deliver the money safely. Instead, the ambush came before sunrise. Riders appeared out of the fog. Like ghosts, gunfire echoed through the canyon walls. Horses screamed. Men fell into the freezing dirt before they even understood what was happening. By the time the shooting stopped, the payroll wagon was gone. So was Samuel Crow. Jonah was found hours later beside the road, wounded but alive, when he finally returned. To Black Hollow weeks later, the story had already spread across the territory. Samuel Crow had betrayed the escort crew. He had joined the outlaws. Who stole the payroll? Some said he had planned the robbery. From the beginning, others claimed he shot 2 of the guards himself. No one knew which parts of the story were true, but the money was gone, and Crow had disappeared. Jonah never defended him. He never argued with the rumors. He simply left. Black Hollow. Not long after recovering from his wounds, years passed, and the legend of Samuel Crow grew darker with every story. Stagecoach robberies, ranchas burned in the night. Men found dead along lonely trails with Crow's name whispered nearby. Meanwhile, Jonah Vale became something else entirely, a gunslinger, not an outlaw. Not exactly a lawman either. But when violence appeared in a town, Jonah Vale was often the last man still standing when the smoke cleared. His reputation spread quietly across the frontier. A man who didn't start fights, but always finished them. And yet, through all those years, one question followed him, everywhere he rode. What really happened in Redstone Pass? Some believed Jonah hunted Crow across the west, waiting for the day he could settle the betrayal with a bullet. Others believed the opposite, that Jonah Vale knew something about that ambush no one else understood. Something that turned 2 friends into enemies. Something buried somewhere in the past, where the truth had never fully surfaced. Now, after a decade of silence, the 2 men stood in the same town again. One tied to a post, the other holding the knife that cut him free, and the people of Black Hollow were beginning to realize that whatever history existed between Jonah Vale and Samuel Crow, it was darker than anyone imagined. The street of Black Hollow had never been so quiet. Nearly 40 men stood facing Jonah Vale, rifles and shotguns resting in nervous hands. The rope that had held Samuel Crow lay cut in the dirt between them, like a line no one quite understood anymore. Crow leaned weakly against the wooden post, breathing through clenched teeth. Blood still soaked the side of his shirt, and every movement looked like it cost him strength he didn't have. But Jonah Vale stood as steady as stone. His hand rested loosely near the grip of his revolver. Not drawing, not threatening, just waitin'. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward first. "Jonah," he said carefully, "you picked the wrong morning to come back." Jonah's eyes moved slowly across the crowd. Men he once knew. Men who had grown older, harder. Some of them had lost family to the outlaw standing behind him. "You're making a mistake," Dalton continued. "Crows wanted across half the territory. There's a price on his head bigger than anything this town's ever seen." Someone shouted from the back of the mob. "He killed my brother," another voice followed. "He burned my ranch." The anger returned quickly, spreading through the crowd like dry grass catching fire. Fingers tightened around rifle triggers. Samuel Crow let out a weak laugh behind Jonah. "Looks like I made quite a reputation." Jonah didn't turn around. "Save your breath," he said quietly. Crow wiped blood from his mouth. "You always were stubborn." That single exchange made the townspeople uneasy. These 2 men weren't strangers meeting for the first time. They spoke like men who had survived something together. Sheriff Dalton noticed it too. His eyes narrowed. "You protecting him because you knew him once," Dalton asked. Or because you helped him? A murmur passed through the crowd. It was a dangerous thought, Jonah. Vale, the famous gunslinger, possibly standing beside the very outlaw they wanted to hang. Jonah finally spoke again. He's leaving this town alive. The words were calm, but they landed like thunder. A man stepped forward from the crowd. A rancher named Caleb Turner, whose face carried the permanent bitterness of someone who had buried too many people. You really ready to kill half this town for him? Turner asked. Jonah's eyes met his. No. The crowd shifted again. Turner smirked. Good. Then step aside. Jonah didn't move. I said, he's leaving alive. The meaning was clear now. Anyone who tried to stop that would have to face Jonah. Vale first. For a moment, no one moved. Then Samuel Crow spoke again from behind him, his voice rough and tired. You should have let them hang me. Jonah finally glanced back at him. Their eyes met for the first time in 10 years. Crow's expression wasn't defiant, it wasn't proud. It looked like regret. Maybe, Jonah said quietly. The town watched the two men stare at each other. Old history passing silently between them. Finally, Crow spoke again. They still think I betrayed you at Redstone Pass. Jonah's voice dropped lower. They think a lot of things. Crow coughed, wincing from the pain in his ribs. Maybe it's time. You told them? Jonah looked back, toward the mob. Rifles, anger, grief, and town, hungry for justice. The wind pushed dust across the street as he slowly removed his hat. All right, Jonah said. If the truth's what this town wants. His voice carried across the silent street. Then listen carefully. Because the story they believed about Redstone Pass was a lie. The wind slowed, as if even the desert wanted to hear what came next. Jonah Vale stood in the center of the street, hat in his hand, eyes fixed on the crowd that had come ready to watch a hanging. You all think Samuel Crow betrayed that payroll escort at Redstone Pass? Jonah said. A few men nodded. Others tightened their grips on their rifles. That's the story that's been riding across the West for 10 years. Jonah paused. But it isn't the truth. Murmurs rolled through the crowd. Dalton stepped up closer. Then start talking, he said. Jonah's gaze drifted briefly toward Crow, who was barely standing now, leaning heavily against the post. The ambush at Redstone Pass wasn't planned by Crow, Jonah continued. It was planned by the men who hired us. That sentence landed like a hammer. Several men frowned in confusion. The mining company? Dalton asked. Jonah shook his head slowly. No. His eyes moved across the street, stopping on a man standing near the back of the crowd. A well-dressed ranch owner who had quietly watched the entire scene unfold. Caleb Turner. Jonah's voice hardened. Turner's freight company was moving that payroll, he said. But the money never belonged to the miners. The crowd shifted, glancing toward Turner. Crow let out a tired breath behind Jonah. Jonah continued. It was insurance money, staged to disappear. Now the street was no longer quiet. What are you saying? Someone shouted. Jonah's eyes never left Turner. I'm saying the robbery was planned before we ever took the job. Crow spoke weakly from behind him. And when Jonah and I realized what was happening, they decided we were witnesses. Jonah nodded once. The ambush wasn't meant to steal the payroll. He looked back at the crowd. It was meant to kill us. The weight of that truth settled slowly over the town. Jonah gestured slightly. Toward Crow. He didn't betray anyone, Jonah said. He dragged me out of that canyon after I was shot, and rode all night to keep me alive. A long silence followed. Then someone asked the question that had suddenly become impossible to ignore. If that's true, all eyes slowly turned toward Caleb Turner. Then why did Samuel Crow run? Asterisk the question hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. All eyes turned toward Caleb Turner. For years, Turner had been one of the most respected men in Black Hollow. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county, funded half the town's businesses, and spoke louder than most whenever justice needed to be served. Now, for the first time, he looked uncomfortable. Samuel Crow answered the question before.
Turner could.
Because they were hunting us. His voice was weak, but the truth inside it was sharp. Crow slowly pushed himself upright, one hand gripping the post for balance. That ambush at Redstone Pass wasn't the end of it, he said. Turner and his partners couldn't risk anyone surviving who knew the truth. He glanced toward Jonah. So I ran. A rancher near the front of the crowd frowned. You could have told someone. Crow gave a tired smile. Who? No one answered. Crow continued. Turner owned the freight company. He controlled the payroll records. He had friends in every town between here and the border. His eyes swept across the men standing in the street. If I walked into a sheriff's office back then and told them Caleb Turner planned the robbery, who do you think they would have believed? The crowd shifted uneasily. Crow nodded toward Jonah. So I made a different choice. Jonah already knew what he was about to say, but the town didn't. Crow looked at them, one by one. I became the villain. Murmurs spread again. Crow coughed before continuing. If Turner believed I was just another outlaw, he'd stop looking for witnesses. Sheriff Dalton's face hardened as the realization formed. You spent 10 years running, he said slowly. Crow shook his head. Not running. His voice dropped. Hunting? The word carried weight. Crow turned his eyes toward Turner. Every stagecoach robbery you heard about, every burned ranch, every outlaw gang that disappeared. He paused. They were men working for him. The street erupted with confused voices. Turner finally stepped forward. That's enough, he said sharply. His calm mask was beginning to crack. You expect these people to believe a wanted murderer over a man who's lived in this town for 20 years. Crow laughed weakly. That's the problem with lies, he said. You have to keep telling bigger ones. Turner's hand moved slowly toward the revolver at his belt. Several men in the crowd noticed. Jonah Vale noticed first. The entire street suddenly felt like dry tinder waiting for a spark. Jonah's voice came low and steady. Don't. Turner ignored him. You rode back into town to clear your name, Turner said to Crow. But all you've done is remind everyone why they wanted you dead. Crow shook his head. I didn't come back for them. His eyes moved toward Jonah. I came back because the truth deserves witnesses. Turner's gun cleared the holster. The moment everyone feared had finally arrived, and every man in Black Hollow knew exactly what happened when someone forced Jonah Vale to draw. Asterisk. Turner's revolver cleared leather, but Jonah Vale was already moving. The sound of his gunshot cracked through the street before most men even realized he had drawn. Turner's weapon flew from his hand, spinning into the dirt as he staggered backward, clutching his bleeding wrist. The crowd exploded into chaos. Some men shouted. Others raised rifles, unsure who they were supposed to aim at. Jonah stood perfectly still again, revolver steady in his hand, smoke drifting slowly from the barrel. No more guns, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the entire street. Turner fell to one knee, fury burning across his face. You think shooting me changes anything? He spat. You've got no proof. Jonah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Samuel Crow. Crow understood the look. Slowly, painfully, he reached into the inside of his coat. Several rifles lifted instantly. "Easy," Crow muttered. He pulled out a weathered leather pouch and tossed it into the dust between them. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward cautiously and picked it up. Inside were folded documents. Old freight records, payroll ledgers, insurance contracts. Dalton's eyes moved quickly across the pages. His expression darkened. "These are signed," he said quietly. Turner's name appeared across nearly every document. Insurance policies filed days before the Redstone Pass shipment. Cargo values exaggerated far beyond their real worth. And one final contract, authorizing the freight route change, that had led the wagon directly into the canyon where the ambush waited. The town slowly realized what they were looking at. Fraud, a staged robbery, murder disguised as bandit work. Dalton looked up at Turner. "You set the whole thing up." Turner's face twisted with rage. "You think a few papers will save that outlaw?" he snapped, pointing at Crow. "He's killed men all across this territory." Crow didn't deny it. Instead, he spoke quietly. "Yes." The honesty silenced the crowd again. "I did." Crow's breathing was heavy now. "Every one of them worked for you." Turner laughed bitterly. "Convenient story." Crow shook his head. "You remember Redstone Pass?" Turner said nothing. Crow continued. "You remember the man you sent to finish Jonah after the ambush?" Jonah's eyes narrowed slightly. Crow looked at the crowd. "I found him 2 years later in Arizona." He paused. He talked. Dalton lowered the papers slowly. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The robberies, the killings, the years of bloodshed. They weren't random outlaw crimes. They were a long, brutal war between two men. Hiding behind the legend of Samuel Crow, Turner slowly stood, clutching his injured wrist. "You still lose," he said. The hatred in his voice was pure now. "You think these people will forgive 10 years of murder because you had a reason?" Crow didn't answer. Instead, Jonah spoke. "They don't have to." The town watched the two gunslingers standing side by side. Jonah looked toward Dalton. "The law decides what happens next." Dalton nodded slowly. But before he could speak, Turner suddenly lunged for the fallen revolver in the dirt. He fired blindly. The shot echoed across Black Hollow. For a split second, no one moved. Then Samuel Crow staggered forward, blood spreading across his chest. Jonah caught him before he hit the ground. Turner tried to fire again, but this time Jonah didn't hesitate. The second shot ended the fight forever. Turner collapsed into the dust. The street fell silent again. Jonah knelt beside the wounded outlaw. Crow's breathing was fading fast. "You always were slow," Crow muttered faintly. Jonah gave the smallest smile. "You always were reckless." Crow coughed weakly. "At least, the truth got here first." The sun was beginning to sink behind the desert hills when the street of Black Hollow finally grew quiet again. Caleb Turner's body had been carried away. The mob had disappeared. Rifles were lowered. Anger replaced by something heavier. The uneasy silence that follows the truth when it arrives too late. Sheriff Dalton stood beside the saloon steps, the documents still in his hands, reading them again as if hoping the pages might suddenly say something different. But they didn't. Across the street, Jonah Vale sat on the dusty ground with Samuel Crow leaning against him. Crow's breathing had grown shallow. Each breath sounded weaker than the last. For 10 years, the West had hunted Samuel Crow. Now the most dangerous outlaw in the territory looked more like a tired man who had simply run out of road. Crow looked toward the fading sunlight. "Funny thing about running," he murmured. Jonah stayed quiet. You think you're chasing justice? Crow continued slowly. But sometimes you're just chasing time. A faint smile crossed his face. Looks like time finally caught me. Jonah tightened his grip slightly to keep him upright. You should have come back sooner. Crow chuckled weakly. And ruin my reputation? The wind moved softly through the empty street. After a moment, Crow's voice dropped lower. You told them the truth? Jonah nodded once. Crow closed his eyes for a moment. Good. For years, the world had believed Samuel Crow was a monster, a traitor, a murderer. But in the end, the truth had finally ridden back into town with him, and that was enough. Crow's breathing slowed, then quietly stopped. Jonah remained there for a long time after the last light of day, stretching across the street where two old friends had finally finished the fight that began 10 years earlier. In the West, legends are often written by the loudest guns, but sometimes they're written by the men who carried the truth the longest. The Wild West wasn't just a place of outlaws and gunfights. It was a place where truth often arrived years too late. Stories like this remind us that legends aren't always what they seem. If you enjoy dark, cinematic Western stories about forgotten gunslingers and hidden truths, subscribe to Whispers of the West and ride with us into the shadows of the frontier.